Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. We're going back to the Middle Ages. Not the clanking swords and grumpy knights edition, but the quieter, herb-scented corners where women stirred wooden spoons in kettles of magic that smelled an awful lot like thyme and vinegar. Before you drift too far, press that like button. Before your eyelids press themselves. Now, the textbooks may have overlooked them, but while wars were being fought and tapestries woven with heroic nonsense, the women of medieval Europe were busy keeping everyone alive, or at the very least, marginally less plaguey. Let's set the scene. Imagine a village wrapped in mist, somewhere in 14th century England. No plumbing, limited literacy, and precisely zero knowledge of bacteria. But the woods nearby are teeming with nettles, yarrow, and secrets. And in a thatched cottage at the edge of town, there's a woman. Perhaps they call her Matilda, or perhaps something that sounds like it should be written on parchment with extra vowels. She is no witch, not that it's helped her reputation, but she does seem to know what to do when someone's husband coughs blood, or when little Oswin has worms again. This is the domain of the medieval wise woman. No potions that sparkle, no swirls of purple fog, just a leather-bound collection of recipes scrawled in a mix of Latin, Old English, and guesswork. We're talking medieval medicine, but from a woman's hands. The unsung pharmacists, midwives, caretakers, and herbalists who knew precisely how to pickle a sheep's bladder or grind dried beetles into what you might call digestive support. Much of their work was practical, passed down orally, and written only when someone had both a quill and a quiet moment, which was rare in a time when chickens roamed inside and pigs occasionally shared the bed. These women collected knowledge the way modern folks collect throw pillows, with enthusiasm, variety, and no real room for it all. Now don't let the crackling fire and sleepy setting fool you. Medieval remedies were not for the faint of heart or faint of stomach. One 12th century spell for warding off infection involved baking a mixture of leeks and wine into a hollow onion and shoving it, well, into a place we dare not describe before bedtime. And yet, surprisingly, it worked. Modern scientists recreated this recipe, known as bull's-eye salve, and found it effective against superbugs, which is encouraging because if leeks and medieval wine can fight bacteria, then so can you. Probably. The wise women's gardens were their laboratories, lavender for sleep, comfrey for bones, feverfew for migraines, and plenty of garlic, because garlic does everything, including keeping overly chatty neighbours away. Their apothecaries were cluttered with jars, not of eye of newt, but fennel, mugwort, wormwood, and the occasional dried toad. Not for magic, for eczema. Apparently, European toads were multitaskers. And because medieval society had the paperwork skills of a sleepwalking squirrel, women's contributions to medicine were rarely recorded under their own names. Even Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun who managed to write volumes on plant lore, mystical theology, and musical compositions, all while eating very little and being very certain that spelt was the only proper grain, was often treated as an exception rather than part of a larger network of female medical knowledge. Our Matilda, remember her, was a quiet genius. Some days, she guided first-time mothers through childbirth with only warm towels and calm hands. Other days, she balanced the humours of local villagers through porridge-based therapies and chamomile foot baths. Occasionally, she treated rashes that very much didn't want to be identified. And though her name didn't make it into the chronicles, her work lived on in whispers, in roots passed down. and in the bundles of herbs hung up to dry above the hearth. Of course, suspicion often followed these women like a shadow. If your herbal tincture helped one day and didn't the next, you could suddenly be accused of sorcery. Made worse by the fact that healing wasn't always straightforward, and advanced medicine often involved leeches and prayers. Still, many communities knew that without Matilda's creations, the winter coughs would take too many. So, quietly, respectfully, they came to her. Tonight, you've met the tip of the yarrow-scented iceberg, a hint of clove in the air, and a murmur of the women who badgered daisies into poultices and whispered Latin over woundwort, hoping to keep just one more soul clinging to their warmed-up breath. Settle now. The candles are low, the herbs are bundled. Somewhere in the shadows, a mortar and pestle wait patiently for tomorrow's remedies. And in the silence between thoughts, you might just hear a page in Matilda's little book, turning, softly. Chapter 2 of Herb Wives and Whispering Gardens. Long before thermometers beeped and pharmacies glowed with sterile light, healing came in the form of whispers, mortar and pestle, and leaves gathered in the hours just before sunrise. Among the hedgerows and cottage gardens of medieval Europe, a quieter form of medicine blossomed, not behind a physician's parchment-strewn desk, but in the dirt-caked hands of women. Gentle, stubborn, clever women. They were known as herb wives, wart-cunners, cunning women, or, when the local priest was in a particularly bad mood, witches. But let us not confuse broomsticks with bramble tea. Most were simply the go-to aunties of their village, wielding knowledge handed down across generations like a well-worn mixing bowl. Their medicine came not in Latin diagnoses and shaved bills, but tied in muslin sachets, steeped in honey wine, or smeared generously on whatever part of you hurt most. And as with all things, some of it helped, some of it didn't, and some of it involved powdered foxlung and an alarming amount of butter. Let us tiptoe now into the sort of garden these women kept. Picture it, a crooked gate leading to a courtyard overflowing with greens of every imaginable hue. Garlic that hangs in braids from doorway beams, lavender sprawled like a sleepy cat along the stone path, angelica, rosehips, lady's bedstraw, and rue. Lovely name, not so lovely taste. All these plants, buzzing softly with bees, carried secrets in their stems. Yarrow, for one, was a favourite. Its fern-like leaves made an excellent compress for wounds, especially if your husband had come off second best while jousting over someone's stolen chicken. Women also knew that yarrow, drunk as a tea, could reduce fever, or possibly summon dreams about flying pigs, depending on who you asked. And then there was mugwort, a silvery herb beloved of midwives, dreamers, and people trying to avoid fleas. Mugwort carried a reputation for providing vivid dreams if placed under your pillow, although it could also cause stomach upset if mistaken for salad. Suffice to say, medieval salads were not for the faint of bowel. Among the tools of the herb wife's trade were books, yes, but not the thick, mysterious tomes of monks. Instead, they kept handwritten recipe scrolls or remembered songs that taught you when to harvest a root, or how to dry thyme on a line strung above your hearth. Sometimes the instructions came in rhymes, as all good medicine should. Pick nettle in May, you'll chase aches away. Pick nettle in June, you'll pick far too soon. Of course, they didn't always have complete control over their apothecaries. Gardens shared space with goats, unpredictable weather, and the occasional judgmental neighbour. And then there were the moonlit superstitions. Certain herbs, they said, must be plucked while walking backward, or while reciting prayers in reverse, or after bribing a toad. Did these things make the herbs more powerful? Perhaps not, but it filled the air with mystery, which, as any medieval person could tell you, was at least half the medicine. Now, some of these women worked quietly, serving their families, tending the sick, murmuring over the heat of an iron pot. But others grew renown beyond their fields. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess who composed music, wrote books on natural healing, and probably could have bested anyone at herbal trivia night. Granted, she had the benefit of a nunnery's library and wasn't interrupted by toddlers eating her lavender. Still, most herb wives relied not on scrolls but senses, touching leaves for texture, peering at colours, sniffing bitter roots with a nose that could detect mould faster than a weathercock at dawn. They were sensory scientists dressed in aprons, and their laboratories were wooden tables stained with marjoram and mugwort, and possibly last week's onion. To their communities, these women were vital. They could ease childbirth pains with a syrup of chamomile and honey. They had something vaguely effective for toothache, usually involving garlic, clove, and mentally pretending you had no teeth. They treated melancholy with lemon balm, and if that failed, they treated it with strong ale and patient conversation. Today, we might overlook their knowledge, dismissing them as folklore figures. But lean in a little, and you'll hear the heartbeat of humanity's first pharmacies, twisting in green stems, dried into fragrant bundles, and stored in clay-glazed pots. All this gathered by hands that often bore more scratches than rings. And as the dusk drapes our herb garden with shadows, let us pause beside an old kitchen door where a pot simmers softly with time and secrets. For tonight, there is more to come. In the cool hush where potions give way to practices forgotten but never truly lost. Chapter 3: The Lavender Ladies and the Onion Whisperers. Nestled in the misty folds of the medieval mind, where herbs had reputations and onions held secrets, there lived a class of women whose talent with tinctures was rivaled only by their keen ability to keep a sick village from turning entirely into a ghost story. These were not grand noblewomen, nor the queens with gold rings and heavier crowns. No, tonight we turn our candlelight toward the herbalists, midwives, and wise women, the cottage apothecaries of the past, whose wooden shelves bore jars labelled in smudged Latin, and whose gardens hummed with life and a hint of mischief. Now, if you're imagining a kind of medieval pharmacist in full spa-day regalia, working by moonlight with sage bundles and luxurious flower oils, you're about half right. Yes, there was lavender. Yes, someone was always hanging something to dry above the fire. But their work was less bath bomb, more battlefield triage with a dash of please stop bleeding now. Let us stroll gently through the fields of Norfolk around the year 1276. The village of Biddlesford by the Marsh, a name I've made up but sounds perfectly musty, was home to one Mistress Agnes, who was known far and wide for her skill in curing boils, stubborn coughs, and, rumour had it, broken hearts. Her tools: a worn mortar and pestle, a truly enviable mortar collection, and a brain full of recipes passed down through spoken word. Also, let us not forget her deeply judgmental cat named Pickle. Mistress Agnes, like many women of her craft, used a method less based in buckled shoes and more in boundless experimentation. She wasn't a witch, though, fair warning, being a competent woman with a working knowledge of bark and mucus might get you called one, especially if your potions actually worked. One of her classics was the humble onion poultice. What we today categorize strictly under things that ruin sandwiches was once a prized item in the medicinal world. Sliced, crushed, warmed, and applied directly to the chest, onions were known to draw out chest infections, or at the very least, draw out complaints from spouses about the smell. Pair this with some honey-laced mead and a prayer to St. Sebastian, the patron saint of archers, plagues, and oddly, pincushions, and you had yourself a proper 13th century healing regimen. Lavender, dreamy lavender, also floated its way into everything from teas to sleep satchels. Mixed with chamomile, it became the medieval sleepy time blend, used to ease frayed nerves and gently encourage those forever dithering maiden aunts to finally drift off mid-story. Lavender was also recommended by Hildegard of Bingen, our favorite 12th century Benedictine abbess, composer, mystic, and the woman most likely to give your dreams a Gregorian soundtrack. But not all treatments were polite and flowery. For example, it was considered perfectly reasonable to brew a concoction of burned rosemary, snails, and vinegar for dandruff. If that made you sigh in modern disbelief, take comfort in knowing it didn't work then either. But it did lend the illusion of doing something, which in medicine, as in relationships, is half the battle. We should also mention the incredible knowledge these women had about the human body. Knowledge shaped by observation, intuition, and generations of whispered wisdom. They knew, for example, how to turn willow bark into a pain reliever, thanks salicin, basically peasant Advil, and when to use mugwort for menstrual cramps. Mugwort, by the way, sounds like something you'd find in a hobbit's satchel, but its reputation as a women's herb was strong and enduring. One herbal manuscript even calls it the mother of herbs, which sounds sacred until you realize how truly unpleasant it smells. And yet, for all the good they did, these knowledgeable women walked a delightfully thin line between healer and heretic. A little success could garner gratitude. Too much, accusations of summoning demons. One clever healer in Devon made it her habit to always burn something that smelled awful during treatments. This way, if the patient lived, she blamed the herbs. If they died, she said the demon escaped through the smoke. And since science was more of a suggestion at the time, folks mostly accepted this explanation with an agreeable grunt. Herbs weren't just medicine, they were protection too. Branches of rowan were strung above doorways, not to cure colds, but to keep wandering spirits from asking to borrow sugar. And women tucking rosemary sprigs into their belts weren't after fragrant pockets. They were hoping to ward off fevers and possibly unappealing suitors. So the next time you sip ginger tea for an upset stomach, remember the countless women hunched over bubbling cauldrons long before you, consulting stars, saints, and soil, crafting care with twig and tincture. Their legacy is not gone. It lives quietly in the steam of midnight brews and the rustling pages of bedside herbals. And, speaking of rustling pages, our next turn of the parchment leads us to the bubbling cauldron of compounds even more curious, where science mixes with superstition and something strange begins to smell like progress. Chapter 4 of Beetles, Breadcrumbs and Botanical Alchemy. In the drowsy hush of a thatch-roofed cottage beside the hearth where the smoke tangled like sleepy thoughts in the rafters, an herbwife quietly crushed beetles at dawn. Now I realize that's not the most lulling image. But stay with me. This wasn't cruelty, nor household pest control. This was medicine, or at least an attempt. You see, medieval women, especially those with a knack for leaves, lard, and Latin prayers, were the apothecaries of their communities. And while their recipes may strike our modern sensibilities as somewhere between charmingly rustic and medically concerning, they treated ailments from toothaches to distant husbands with a startling degree of creativity. Take the humble lady known in her village as Mistress Godeliva, for instance. No one quite knew whether Godeliva was her first name or just a handy local contraction of "God deliver us, she's making another poultice." Either way, she was part healer, part hedge witch, and part therapist, armed with a mortar, a robe with more pockets than a wizard's cloak, and a dazzling knowledge of regional fungi. Her remedies often involved things from the kitchen, because, as Godeliva once said over a bubbling pot of something vaguely purple, why not cure thyself with the same things that soothe thy stew? Bread crusts soaked in elderflower tea, wonderful for dampening melancholy. A paste of mustard seed, lard and vinegar, excellent for chest congestion and scaring away suitors. And for head lice, a particularly pesky medieval foe, she bravely recommended a gentle rubbing of crushed beetles and goose fat. Now you may feel the urge to furrow your brows here, but remember, lice were the unofficial court jesters of the Middle Ages, turning up uninvited, feeding freely, and snubbing all attempts at eviction. So Godeliva's beetle salve, while odd to our ears, was loaded with natural oils, mild acids, and, most critically, gumption. Beyond beetles and breadcrumbs, some women practiced a form of early alchemy, not quite turning lead into gold, but certainly turning onions into ointments. In monastic gardens and wildflower meadows alike, women meticulously gathered plants with enchanting names: woundwort, betony, horehound, and feverfew. These weren't just whimsical herbs, they were the materia medica of medieval femininity. Chamomile was known to calm both bellies and belligerent toddlers. Yarrow coiled its bitter leaves into infusions that allegedly soothed fevers and soldiers' regrets. And lavender. Lavender was the medieval equivalent of turning on a white noise machine, a scent so soft and nostalgic it could lull even the most troubled minds to rest. These women, herbwives, midwives, and healers, didn't need formal training. Their knowledge was passed from mother to daughter like a family quilt, stitched together with whispers, observation, and the occasional chicken sacrifice. For purely symbolic purposes, of course, mostly, sometimes. Their work was as much about care as about cure. They would arrive with bundles of nettle and unwelcome advice, murmuring Latin prayers that may or may not have been actual Latin. A visit from them was more than a treatment. It was an act of community closeness in a world where science slept soundly and God got most of the credit for everything, even if Godeliva had done the heavy lifting with a jar of pigeon grease. And when remedies didn't work, because not every mixture of sage and ash could actually reverse baldness, well, the healer simply shrugged, murmured something about the stars being out of sorts, and tried again with more nettles and a firmer chant. It wasn't always glamour and goosefeather plasters, though. Occasionally, these women with their curious concoctions were accused of witchcraft. After all, if one can cure a fever with a tea of unknown leaves, who's to say she couldn't also hex your best pig? There was a fine, delicate line between saintly helper and suspicious crone, and one poorly timed wild cackle could tip the scale either way. Still, in quiet cottages and behind alehouse gardens, women brewed comfort daily. They soothed sore bellies, eased births, and helped the grieving with herbs too gentle for history books. Their knowledge hummed in the leaves and fermented in clay jars by the windowsill, waiting patiently, as women so often did, to be seen. Now, As we let the scent of rosemary and old recipe parchments linger in the air just a little longer, our eyelids begin to flutter like beetle wings in a brass mortar. Get cozy, for tomorrow, when the morning mists rise, we'll step quietly into the world of lullabies, blessings, and the peculiar potions made just for the heart. Chapter 5 of Snails, Salves, and Saintly Remedies. Nestled between the pages of forgotten herbals and the driftwood drawers of medieval cupboards, there lies a small, slimy surprise. The snail. Yes, the humble garden snail, slowest of creatures and unexpected darling of medieval medicine. Tonight, dear listener, we descend softly into the damp and delightful world of medieval poultices, where moss met marrow and healers eyed the hedgerow with deep-rooted suspicion and delight. To the medieval woman, whether a nun copying recipes by rushlight or a village wise woman with muddy hems, anything that crept, sprouted, or buzzed was fair game for healing. And let us not forget, this was a time when you might cure a cough with grated turnip and a whisper of holy water, or lose an arm to a minor splinter. The stakes were high. The salves were, well, surprisingly sticky. Now, back to snails. According to Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century polymath, nun, an absolute queen of holistic multitasking, snails boiled in beer made for an excellent salve against skin infections. Naturally, the key was not the boiling or the beer, although who could blame you for assuming as much? It was the mucilage, that unctuous trail of goo left in a snail's stately wake. Slimy, yes, but it worked, allegedly. In the Middle Ages, a dose of snail slime and a prayer to Saint Erasmus covered most eventualities. Speaking of saints, many remedies were mixing bowls of the divine and the bizarre. St. John's wort, a cheery yellow herb blooming beneath summer skies, was plucked on the saint's feast and used to chase away melancholy and demons. In reality, it contains hypericin, a mild antidepressant. But in 1247, a peasant plucking it at dawn believed it fended off evil spirits, and possibly her second cousin's gout. Hard to say which was worse. Herbs weren't simply tossed into kettles like stew vegetables. No, their collection was something between ritual and choreography. Pick yarrow under a waxing moon. Speak no words when gathering mugwort, lest it hear your secrets and wilt from shame. And always, always face east when collecting lavender. Not because lavender cared particularly, but because that's where the sun comes from. And by medieval logic, that made it morally superior. Back in the kitchen, or the sacred corner of the cottage that served as a laboratory, healers would mash, steep, and dry their botanical treasures with quiet assurance. Elderflower for colds, comfrey for bruises, nettle for everything from joint pain to a suspiciously crabby neighbour. It was part science, part witchcraft, all passed down in crooked handwriting and smoke-scented memory. And what tools they had. Truly, no sleep story is complete without a dreamy inventory. Wooden mortars worn smoother than lullabies, charred iron kettles with permanently enthusiastic lids, herb bundles dangling from ceiling beams, green, silver, fragrant, some drying, some forgotten, all humming with quiet magic. A ladle was the medieval woman's wand, and yes, sometimes it doubled as a weapon. Let's not forget animal bits, because we can't. Medieval medicine was a parade of ingredients borrowed, willingly or not, from the barnyard. Ox bile to soothe indigestion, boiled fox lungs seasoned with salt for asthma. One fine volume suggests placing a swallow's heart on your tongue to help you speak well in court. A smaller note adds that it works best if the heart is still warm. Charming. But behind the oddity the sisters, mothers, and midwives of the age were learning. They had no microscopes, no degrees, and certainly no antiseptic. What they did have was time-honed instinct and a library of observation. If calendula healed wounds faster, they noticed. If leeches made someone dizzy, they adjusted. If the mayor's son turned purple after drinking fermented parsnip tonic, well, another notch in ye, old, perhaps not column. And so the medieval woman became pharmacist, folklorist, and field nurse, armed with remedies pulled from soil and superstition. She was seldom thanked, often questioned, and occasionally accused of consorting with witches, which was a bit unfair, given that she was often the village witch and had quite a lot to do regardless. Now, let the scent of rosemary and the soft bubbling of elderberry syrup lull you to rest. For nearby, under candlelight and steam, another recipe was beginning, one that would turn roses into remedies and headaches into history. And on that herbal note, we'll steep softly forward into the curious world of enchanted gardening, where seeds were spells and planting a leek had consequences. Chapter 6 of Rosewater Recipes and the Art of Disappearing Warts. Ah, the lovely scent of rosewater wafting through an early medieval cottage, or, more accurately, the faint aroma of boiled petals trying their best to compete with the more assertive odours of the 12th century. Damp wool, freshly dumped chamber pots, and Geoffrey the goat drying himself too close to the hearth. Still, rosewater held its own. Tonight, let us meander softly through the flower-strewn remedies of medieval women, who stirred petals, herbs, and a whisper of magic into concoctions designed to soothe both skin and soul. With mortar in hand and pestle rocking gently, these women were the pharmacists of the village, and the only ones who made medicine smell like a midsummer's dream. Let us begin in the herb garden, moonlit and murmuring with the sounds of wind and owls. Here you'd find matronly hands brushing over lavender, rue, and chamomile, gathering not just ingredients, but intentions. The rose petals were plucked at dawn because, as every wise healer knew, petals whispered their secrets more freely in the morning. Roses meant more than beauty. They offered cooling properties for feverish brows, calming grace for nervous humours, and a surprisingly decent tonic for inflamed skin, assuming you could keep Geoffrey out of the basin. Now, while a noblewoman in a stone manor might have received her rosewater in a decorated bottle carved with verses, the village healer made hers in a less romantic but sturdier cauldron. Dried petals, distilled rainwater, and perhaps a pinch of salt for preservation. The resulting tincture, a fragrant liquid said to cleanse faces, heal sore eyes, and, in one boldly optimistic case, banish sadness from the heart. Early medieval labelling was less than precise, and everything had at least 5 uses because, well, guesswork was half the fun. But rosewater wasn't merely cosmetic. When cooled properly and sprinkled on linens, it helped ward off pestilence, or at least made pestilence smell more acceptable. When mixed with a poultice of meadowsweet and a dash of vinegar, it transformed into a rudimentary astringent, and when dabbed behind the ears during times of trial or gossip, it allegedly gave women the strength to pretend their husbands' opinions were interesting. These healers, some formerly known as wise women, and others more shrewdly known as Bess with the blue bottles, didn't just rely on flora for common ailments. They were also unofficial champions in the war against warts, a battle few honour in our history books, though many toads gave valiant service. You see, wart removal in medieval times was less about sophisticated creams and more about panache. One popular method involved rubbing the offending blemish with a raw onion at sunrise, then burying the onion in a crossroads at midnight. The logic, sparse though it may seem, ran thus. When the onion rotted, so would the wart disappear. Another approach involved touching the wart with a piece of bacon and feeding said bacon to a stray dog, thus transferring the wart through the digestive sacrifices of man's best friend. Let's pause briefly and offer a silent thanks to every medieval dog who unwittingly became part of a dermatological ritual. Of course, these treatments weren't purely whimsical. The onion and crossroads routine actually has trace elements of plant-based acidity and nocturnal superstition, paired with a keen sense of ritual psychology. In other words, if you believed it might work, and you had to sneak out with purpose under a silver-tinted moon to try it, you gave the treatment a fair shot, and perhaps the placebo effect did the rest. It was not simply the potion, but the process. The slow stirring, the whispered prayers, the scent of thyme on the wrists and wild mint in the rafters. Healing was part ceremony, part science, and mostly trust in the maker, in the herbs, and in the possibility that even in an age of swords and soot, a few petals could protect you from heartbreak, or at least from head lice. And nestled among these fragrant jars and hopeful rituals was something extraordinary, even if the church didn't always agree. Women holding knowledge, preserving it not in books, but in busy hands and humming mouths. They passed it from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, as quietly as dusk sliding into evening. As the hearth coals settle and the mortars are washed and left to drip dry on wooden shelves, we wander onward, towards something a little stronger than rosewater. For nestled in the corners of these same kitchens were darker, more secret recipes, tonics for pain not spoken of, and tinctures whispered about under breath. But that is a dream for another chapter, dear listener. Chapter 7. Lavender Under Moonlight, the Quiet Alchemy of Scents. Let us drift now into the quieter corners of the medieval world, far from the clang of iron and the rustle of parchment, and step gently into the herb garden. At night. Not much stirred after sundown in the small peasant villages of the 13th century. Not unless you counted the occasional owl, a suspiciously nimble-looking cat, or Beatrice the midwife, who preferred gathering her herbs after dark. You see, she claimed the moonlight coaxed out the plant's magic. Whether it was the moon or simply solitude she preferred, we'll never truly know. But her basket was always fragrant and full. For Beatrice and many of her contemporaries, plants weren't just greenery, they were spells in leaf form. A sprig of thyme could warm a wintered chest. A pull of chamomile could coax a grumpy baby into the arms of sleep. And lavender. Lavender. Lavender was something of a celebrity in the medieval apothecary world. If herbs had an agent, lavender would have booked stage time before a royal audience. The sleepy purple blooms were sun-dried and turned into sachets, tucked under pillows, stitched into the hems of veils, and floated in baths of the nobility and the exhausted shepherd alike. It was said to ease nervous minds and aching joints. Skeptical monks wrote it off as superstition, until it helped Sister Agnes sleep through matins for the first time in 14 years. Then it became labelled as devoutly soothing. But lavender wasn't lavishing in prestige alone. Other botanicals bustled onto Beatrice's moonlit roster. There was valerian, smelling faintly of sweaty socks to modern noses, but known then as all heal. It was dabbed behind ears to tame hysteria, which, by medieval definition, could very well just mean having an opinion. Mother of thyme, sweet marjoram, and the ever-humble fennel found their way into ointments for women's complaints, a catch-all term for anything from menstrual cramps to melancholy stemming from an unwise marriage. These herbs were mixed into poultices and steam infusions, brewed in sturdy iron pots over low flames, while women hummed ancient tunes in kitchens that smelled of onion, hope, and just a little bit of goat. In noble courts, the well-to-do ladies had more lavish means at their disposal. Perfumed wines, infused with rose petals and cardamom, promised to cleanse the womb, a phrase which here means anything from boosting fertility to casually rearranging the humours, a popular pastime before Netflix. Some ladies even slept with sachets of hops sewn into velvet pouches and tucked inside their bodices. Why hops? Because it was believed that the same essence that relaxed the liver in ale could calm the turbulent seas of one's emotions. Emotional turbulence was often considered inconvenient in noble women, unless it could be expressed via embroidery or polite fainting. It's important, and oddly touching, to note that no herb was ever seen as just a physical treatment. Medieval women interacted with their remedies much like we might a favorite tea mug or a worn novel. There was comfort in routine, in crushing and storing, in lighting the oil lamp and whispering a prayer over a cooling decoction. Each scent-stained cloth and chirping kettle tethered a woman to her knowledge, to her instincts, and to the quiet strength passed down from her foremothers. There are few records of Beatrice's kind. The medical writings of the time rarely recorded women's voices. Their lore was passed not in ink, but in touch and tradition, by word of mouth and worn hands. Yet, if you close your eyes and imagine the soft crush of sage between fingers, the flutter of skirts in a midnight garden, the scent of lavender rising under a waning moon, you'll find her, or someone very much like her. And maybe, if the night is quiet enough, you might hear the stir of her basket and the gentle rustle of rosemary as she makes her way down the garden path, already thinking about who needs help mending more than just their sore shoulder. Shh now. Let's follow her footsteps a little farther, toward a very curious little subject indeed, the medieval concept of womb wandering, and why it led to some poor woman being resuscitated by warm cheese. But that's a tale best savoured in soft candlelight. Chapter 8. The Lavender Ladies and the Apothecaries' Garden. Welcome back to the slower rhythm of the old world, where time dripped like honey, and even the most urgent ailments had to wait until the dew had dried. Tonight, we wander into a quieter corner of the medieval village, past the clanking forge and the clucking hens, until we arrive at the edge of a modest garden, perfumed with purpose and ruled by the local herbal women, known fondly and occasionally fearfully as the Lavender Ladies. Now, despite their rather floral nickname, these weren't the sort of ladies who sat idly arranging posies. No, these women had dirt under their fingernails, secrets in their mortar and pestle, and more knowledge of the human body than most forest monks and bumbling barbers combined. They knew which leaves soothed the cough, which blooms softened a sorrow, and which roots you definitely shouldn't eat unless you wanted to meet your ancestors prematurely. You see, before modern medicine got its white coat and pharmaceutical jingles, healing often came wrapped in muslin bundles and tied with twine, passed down from mother to daughter over shared bread and softened candlelight. These gardens, tended with patient hands and weather-worn knees, functioned as both pharmacy and library. You didn't just grow herbs, you cultivated memory. In the East Midlands, there survived the name of one such woman, whispered into a 14th century parish record with faint annoyance. Her name was Maud Hatherley, listed only as a widow of strange remedies and a persistent smell of thyme. A compliment, surely. Maud's cottage backed into a hillside thick with yarrow, mugwort, and marjoram. Her small garden, according to legend, and that always trustworthy medieval gossip, could cure toothaches, nightmares, and even excessive fondness for ale, though why one would want that cured is unclear. One of her most loved concoctions was known as sleepy water, a brew made from poppy petals, boiled lightly with milk and sweetened with honey stolen from particularly aggressive bees. Mothers often traded eggs or spun wool for a thimbleful, hoping to coax fussy babies or quarrelsome husbands into early slumber. But let's not romanticize too much. Medieval herbal women did not have it easy. Their line of work walked a delicate line between welcome wisdom and dangerous witchery. Too many cures too quickly, and people muttered devil's work. Not enough success, and you were simply a fraud with an herb addiction. Still, most villages knew better than to lose their lavender lady. After all, who else had a salve ready when you fell into the blackberry bush, again, looking for something you swore was a goose? In some monastic records, we find evidence of women apothecaries operating within convents, ordered gardens laid out in celestial patterns, where nuns plucked feverfew and hyssop with whispered prayers and gentle scientific inquiry. Contrary to popular picture books, not all nuns were meekly murmuring rosaries. Some were busy distilling lavender oil and writing down dosage notes in careful Latin. Competent, devout, and probably less patient with sinuses than with sins. To be clear, the medieval medicinal garden was rarely about curing terminal diseases or reversing time. It was about surviving, easing, coping. In a world where licensed physicians were expensive, suspiciously cheerful, and fond of bloodletting at the first sneeze, the village women with their balm-soaked hands offered remedies rooted in both the earth and the humble wisdom of repetition. They were the reason sore muscles found comfort, babies stopped wailing before dawn, and elderly ankles survived another week of gouty groaning. With a pinch of sage, a spoonful of vervain, and an uncanny ability to remember where they'd planted what, these women tended to the unglamorous miracles of daily life. But perhaps the real magic lived not in the chamomile or the coltsfoot, but in the ritual, the slow gathering at sunrise, the muttered blessing over a steaming cup, the shared stories infusing every infusion. Healing, you see, wasn't just botanical, it was social. You didn't just feel better, you felt remembered. And so, as twilight settles over their green plots, you can almost hear the gentle rustle of skirts among valerian stalks and angelica stems. The ground still holds their footprints, soft and sure. And speaking of sure footsteps, soon we shall tiptoe towards something altogether more fragrant. An aromatic tradition brewed not in gardens, but in kitchens, where practical women and bubbling cauldrons dealt daily with matters of scent, spirit, and rather risky rinses. Chapter 9. The Potion Behind the Pantry Door. Let's drift now into one of the quietest corners of the medieval world, the pantry. Yes, the pantry. Possibly not where you thought we'd find secrets uncovered with herbs and hope, but that's precisely the charm. Far from the battlefield, and even further from the throne room, the pantry in a medieval household was a sort of secret chamber of practical magic, and no one wielded its powers quite like the women who kept it running. Forget dragons and sorcery. Real alchemy was happening behind the spice jars and barley sacks. Picture it. A wooden shelf groaning slightly under the weight of ceramic crocks. beeswax candles flickering beside bundles of dried herbs and hanging from the rafters, long strings of onions, garlic, and perhaps a bundled bouquet of what looked like a child's failed plant project. But appearances deceived. Behind the flowers and fats was often a quiet collection of what we'd call today an apothecary kit, lovingly assembled and with considerable trial and error and trial again. This was the homemaker's arsenal against fevers, swollen joints, bellyaches, and sometimes meddlesome husbands. Take dill, for instance. Just a humble herb, isn't it? Except in the 13th century, it was cherished as a carminative, a fancy word for helps with gas. A noble lady wouldn't dare burp at court, and so dill water, made by steeping the seeds into a curious cloudy concoction, was the secret behind her serene smile at the feast. Fennel was also popular. The Romans started the trend, but medieval women perfected the fennel habit. Not just tasty, but believed to improve eyesight. So naturally, it became the base for many tinctures politely referred to as clear vision tonics. It's possible, of course, that chugging bitter herbal syrups just made you squint less judgmentally at your neighbor. Now let's not gloss over the real star potion of the pantry, oxymel, a wonderful name that sounds like it belongs in a wizard's staff, but is really just a mix of vinegar and honey. Sweet, sour, and somewhere between a sore throat remedy and a medieval dare. Oxymel was the medieval multi-tool, taken for coughs, colds, and grumpy dispositions. It was even added to other preparations to brace them up, like putting a medieval energy drink in your potion. Then there was sage, thyme, rosemary. Without them, the pantry might have just been called the sad broom closet. These herbs weren't only for cooking lamb stew into something civilized. Sage, for example, was treasured as the herb of immortality. One 10th century medical text earnestly asked, "Why should a man die when sage grows in his garden?" Though the answer, frankly, was often dysentery. In the corners of this pantry laboratory, women kept vinegar infusions in stoppered pots. Vinegar of the Four Thieves, for instance, was born in later plagues, of course, but its spirit got warming experiments centuries earlier. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and rue soaked in vinegar were expected to ward off not only disease, but also, evidently, bad smells and worse neighbors. You dab it behind your ears and suddenly feel like you had control over microbes and your own destiny. Don't be fooled by the walls of grain and salted fish. This was a place of subconscious science. There were no glassware kits or measuring cylinders. Everything was dug from the soil, boiled, dried, soaked, or whispered over. Recipes passed from mother to daughter, scribbled in barely legible Latin, or just remembered the way a grandmother remembers how much salt is right for soup, by feel, by scent, and by stories. And some stories were more cautionary than curative. A single mouldy jar could lead to hours of prayer and theorizing. Was the moon too high? Did the cows walk in a counterclockwise direction past the herbs that morning? Had someone offended St. Hildegard? But through trial and test they went on. Women whose names we'll never learn. Hands red from tending radish and rosemary alike. Brewing wellness in a world long before penicillin and health insurance. Their pantry was power. Their potions, answers in glass without a label. And now, as we quietly pull the pantry door closed behind us, candles dimming and dried fennel swinging lazily in the breeze, we begin to wonder what else they knew. Not just about medicine, but about memory, mood, and maybe dreams. Let's follow that thread a little deeper as we walk toward a finer feather of their legacy. Tonics not for the body, but for the restless soul. Chapter 10: Rosewater Remedies and the Alchemy of Laundry Day. Let us step gently now into the fragrant world behind stone kitchen doors and linen-draped work tables, the slow swirling realm where lavender met lard, and rose petals had more jobs than a medieval cowherd's apprentice. In our modern melon-scented world of supermarket soaps and bath bombs named Mystical Moon Cradle, you might forget that in medieval times, the making of something that merely smelled nice was suspiciously close to magic. And who, dear listener, brewed this olfactory sorcery? Largely women, soap stoutresses, tincture tinkers, and midwife mixologists. Their kitchens were both laboratories and sanctuaries, fragrant fortresses against the less fragrant elements of medieval life, which was, let's be honest, often one long olfactory offense. Let's begin with rosewater. You might now associate it with boutique bakeries or overpriced face mists, but back in the 12th century, it was the holy grail in a jug. Distilled from petals by stillroom-savvy women, rosewater wasn't just for sniffing dreamily while lounging on brocade, though plenty of medieval noblewomen did just that while pretending they weren't judging the embroidery of peasants. Rosewater was used in everything from medicine to cosmetics to medieval mood lighting, that is, splashing it generously on linens before guests arrived so their noses would twitch with delight instead of despair. It was a symbol of hygiene, beauty, and worldly sophistication in an era where one's daily scent was often best described as pre-bath cheese seller. Women skilled in its crafting were admired, envied, and occasionally accused of witchcraft. What else was new? Then there was the art of laundry, but not as you know it, with gentle cycles and fabric softener commercials starring golden retrievers. Medieval laundry was a full-body sport. Women hauled cold spring water, grated aged soap, scrubbed linens on stones or over barrels, and summoned divine courage before boiling undergarments to exorcise whatever 14th century horrors had set up residence in them. But here's where history gets soothing and unexpectedly lovely. Laundry herbs were part of the potion. Women added sweet flag, lavender, rosemary, and sometimes mint to the rinse water. These weren't just for smell, though heaven knows they helped, but also for their believed antimicrobial properties. Whether that was spiritually antiseptic or simply botanical optimism is still debated, but the result? Bedsheets that offered the weary sleeper a whiff of something fresh, clean, herbal, like turning in for the night on a gently perfumed meadow with fewer frogs. One popular technique was to line dry sheets over hedgerows of rosemary or lavender, so the fabrics would take on nature's scent, as one 13th century washerwoman wrote in a gulled-together margin note. Though to be fair, she may have just been trying to flirt with a monk under surveillance. This marrying of science and scent was quietly revolutionary. At a time when most male physicians were treating maladies with leeches and prayer, women were steaming damp cloths with thyme to clear a head cold, or wrapping chesty children in warm, rose-infused wraps to ease coughing. Women weren't merely cleaning clothes. They were infusing domestic life with a kind of quiet, aromatic stability. Home became not just a structure, but a sensory balm. And speaking of infused serenity, we mustn't forget the medieval method of sweet sleep sachets. Now that's a phrase that belongs on a pillow. Women layered dried herbs, lavender, chamomile, valerian root, and sometimes rose petals, into tiny linen pouches tied with string and placed under pillows. Some were sewn into mattress corners. They weren't just for spa-like slumber. People believed these sachets could ward off bad dreams, the plague, and husbands who snored too loudly, though the latter persisted stubbornly into modernity. The knowledge these women carried about which petals soothed, which roots stirred sleep, which stems warded off fleas and unwelcome visions, was often passed down not in books, but in quiet conversation over laundry carts and still-room shelves. Soft teachings, whispered recipes, woven into lives lived at thresholds of care and craftsmanship. So next time you pour a few drops of essential oil into your bath, or squirt rose water on your face after a long day, give a drowsy nod to the women of distillations past, who blended beauty, comfort, and medicinal mischief into daily life with the same grace they used to scrub laundry. Their scented legacy drifts on, like lavender through a linen chest. And as we fold up our herb-whispered linens for the evening, we step gently into the twilight hush of what came next, something warm and softly bitter, brewed in much smaller ceramic pots. Chapter 11. The Lavender Apothecary and the Cunning Woman's Cat. If you had wandered through a sleepy English village sometime in the 14th century, perhaps in slippers, and perhaps only in your imagination, you might have caught a drift of something sweet and strange in the breeze. Lavender, thyme, and possibly a whisper of magic. Tucked behind weathered thatch and whispering hedgerows lived a type of woman often known as a cunning woman, wise, practical, and incidentally better at healing people than most university-trained men. These women were curators of cupboard wonders, keepers of smoky dried herbs, sagging pouches of powdered roots, and tiny odd bottles with scraggly labels like Drachny's Tale or Nun's Comfort. They were part pharmacist, part therapist, and part neighborhood curiosity. Their most loyal assistants, cats, frequently and unfairly accused of felony wizardry, but mostly just asleep in baskets of nettles, with no intention of summoning anything more sinister than their supper. One such wise woman, let's choose to call her Alice, ran a particularly snug apothecary from her cottage near the edge of the forest, in a West Saxon hamlet that sounds like a sneeze when pronounced correctly. Her shop was not on any official register, mostly because no such register existed, and also because bureaucracy hadn't quite reached hedgerow level yet. Alice specialized in what she vaguely termed remedies for persistent botherment, a phrase that could cover anything from gout to lovesickness, or an inconvenient rash picked up while dancing too enthusiastically at midsummer. Her shelf was organized, if we stretch the definition of the word, by the nearest letter she could remember for each herb. Agrimony might be next to Annie's, and also next to Arrow's, and an old apple from last August. It was not alphabetical, so much as agriculturally aesthetic. Lavender, though. Lavender she treated with reverence. Bundles of it hung like sleepy chandeliers above the fireplace. It sweetened the air, discouraged moths and melancholy, and was essential for her most requested concoction, the dreamer's draught. A potion brewed gently with warm milk, 3 snips of lavender, and a pinch of something she only referred to as the dusk's kindness. She claimed it could lull even a barking husband to silence. Do you suppose it worked, you ask? That depends on your faith in lavender and the placebo effect, and how deep the draught was. Her cat, a mottle of dubious parentage named Sybil, was more skeptical. Though she rarely shared her thoughts aloud, on account of being a cat, she had opinions. She would curl on the windowsill with a half-closed eye on the bubbling cauldron, twitching an ear each time Alice sprinkled in a pinch more chamomile, as if to say, too much, again. Sybil was also a detector of belly-ached liars, known for meowing only at customers who despite asking for elderberry tincture, clearly desired something more seductive from the apothecary's hidden shelf. That shelf, kept behind a flour sack and a slightly judgmental wooden spoon, held the things that made churchmen nervous: wild carrot seed for family planning, pennyroyal for purge and protest, and even a small vial of willow's weep, a mild pain-relieving essence that Alice swore by and the local physician swore at. It is worthy of pause, and perhaps a sleepy sigh, to note that in a time when learning was cloistered and male, women like Alice practiced a kind of literacy all their own, not of ink and parchment necessarily, but of pulse and plant and pain. They decoded suffering not into Latin, but into nettle tea and a warm compress. Their therapy was rooted in earth and touch and soup. And while the university-trained physicians rubbed their bearded chins over urine charts and tossed leeches like confetti, the village returned again and again to the lavender-scented doorway of their local cunning woman. Because she listened, she brewed, she didn't lecture, and unfairly, she didn't charge by the sneeze. Of course, such comfort couldn't always remain unbothered. Whispers of witchcraft came with every warm bowl of elderberry porridge that cured something without getting the bishop's approval. But for decades, women like Alice survived by humility, herbcraft, and the soft anonymity of village life, tucked away like the pressed flowers in the back of her old grimoire. And as Sybil purred herself gently to sleep atop a bag labelled "extra time, but never enough," Alice prepared her evening tonic, for herself this time, a little balm for tired hands, and perhaps a dreamless sleep for a day's good work. And so, as the moon peered into the apothecary window with mild curiosity, and one sleepy owl blinked at nothing in particular, we too might follow the scent of lavender toward quieter dreams, and into the next delightfully drowsy tale, where medicines meet mystery, and sickness occasionally meet snakes. Chapter 12. The Lavender Lads and the Garlic Girls. Smelly Secrets of a Medieval Apothecary. By day, the medieval apothecary was a bustling hub of herb-scented mystery, a cross between a mystical pantry and a glorified spice rack. But by night, it turned into something far more whimsical. Picture a moonlit chamber filled with dry bundles hanging from rafters like sleepy bats, their stems bound in twine, their leaves whispering secrets in the dark. If you listened closely, you might almost hear the oregano trying to gossip with the sage. Of all the curious figures who fluttered in and out of these humble aromatic havens, it was the village women who knew exactly what to reach for when life demanded either a remedy or a clever excuse to avoid spinning wool. "Oh no, I'd love to join you at the loom," they'd say, clutching a sprig of yarrow. "But the tincture of my spleen says otherwise." In this chapter, we pause to admire what might just be medieval women's most underrated contribution to popular chemistry: herb lore that smelled, well, bold. Let us begin with lavender. These days, it wafts through yoga studios and pillow sprays, but in the 13th century, lavender was practically a medieval celebrity. Women dried it in neat satchels, tucked it into linen cupboards to frighten off moths and mustiness, and even infused it into oils to rub on sore joints, or to mask the lingering odour of husbands who'd been out mucking the pigs. One gallant Geetha of Norfolk, a washerwoman with a profound dislike for both lice and awkward dinner guests, was said to burn dried lavender stems in her hearth before visitors arrived. "Keeps out pests," she'd mutter. No one could ever tell if she meant the bugs or the people. Then came garlic, nature's kiss, with benefits. Beyond infusing stews and repelling the romantically hopeful, garlic had a medicinal rap sheet impressive enough for its own holy day. Women used it as an antiseptic, a dewormer, and even, curiously, as a salve against toothaches. One daring manuscript from 1310 recommends crushing garlic with goose fat and smearing it underneath the jowl until the spirit ceases to tremble. Wiggle room on the exact definition of spirit was left to the interpreter, or perhaps the goose. There were the garlic girls too, nimble-fingered hedge women who roamed the edges of villages with woven baskets and suspiciously powerful breath. They came bearing ointments for boils, brews for coughs, and blistering opinions on foot hygiene. Never underestimate the foot credibility of a garlic girl. They had seen things. Moving on to mint, oh sweet, sprightly mint. Not only was it chewed for freshness, long before the concept of a toothbrush, it also symbolized hospitality. So much so, in fact, that placing mint under your threshold was akin to an ancient Airbnb review saying, 5 stars, host did not hex me. Mint was also handed to women in labor, not as a remedy per se, but more like a sympathetic snack. As one midwife recorded in a Flemish birthing manual, give her mint to chew for courage, and for the breath, post-bellow. Amid all this sensory splendor were rosemary and rue, sisters in scent and bitter in temperament. Rosemary, worn in bridal crowns, was also boiled into teas for digestion. Rue, on the other hand, had a slightly darker reputation. It was said to ward off plague, witches, and curiously, bad dreams. Women stitched it into the hems of their skirts, less for health and more because nothing says, "Don't mess with me," like rustling into church smelling like a herbal apocalypse. A gentle tale persists of a woman known only as Brunhilde the Blue, whose tiny house was pressed into a hillside near Canterbury, and whose front door clanked open every Thursday precisely at noon. Inside, women sat in warm candlelight, holding slippery vials and teacups of steaming infusions. The lavender made them sleepy, the thyme made them braver, and the gossip made everything feel just a bit more manageable. And so it went. Potions not just for healing the body, but for soothing the soul, warding off melancholy, or excusing oneself from dinner at the bishop's. As candlelight flickers and the fire hisses low, we ease into the night, where herbal secrets rest like soft petals in a vellum-bound grimoire. Let us drift now toward the scent of smoke, over cottage rooftops and past moonlit fields, as we wander toward the whispered world of medieval dream potions. Chapter 13. The Sleepy Science of Smelling Herbs. Of all the mysterious objects in a medieval woman's toolkit, perhaps none were more lovingly fussed over than her posy of herbs. Carefully gathered, tied with string or ribbon, tucked into a pouch at the waist or placed beside the bed, these humble bundles of green leaves and dried blossoms were less about cooking and more about chasing away curses, calming coughs, and making bedrooms smell less like goat. Herbcraft, as it was known by the more bookish of the time, and by the occasional overly poetic goat herd reciting love verses near a hedge, was a quiet science, a leafy, rustling, sniffly sort of science, the kind that required no university degree, just good instincts, generous patience, and the willingness to risk accidentally curing a neighbour's boils when you meant only to freshen the air. Now, imagine Margaret, whose cottage was often described by her neighbours as smelling like something vaguely healing. Margaret was what some might now call an herbalist, and what her less imaginative in-laws called a woman who talks to sage. Every morning she visited her garden patch, a tangle of green life where lavender gossiped with rosemary and chamomile drowsed under the sun, with a basket and a hum. She snipped sprigs with her short iron scissors, while murmuring small phrases like, "You're a good plant," or "Don't listen to what the vicar said. You soothe headaches just fine." And in truth, many women like Margaret were the quiet chemists of their time, steeping herbs in oil, soaking them in vinegar, or simply tucking them into linen sachets to hang near windows or sew into pillows. Take, for example, the famed medieval tussie-mussy. It sounds like a dance, or perhaps a cousin fond of giving damp kisses, but it was actually a small bouquet of aromatic herbs and flowers worn by women, or even clutched tightly during a trip into town. People believed that illness floated in through the nostrils like an uninvited party guest, so it only made sense to block the olfactory entrance with something nicer smelling, like mint and marjoram, rather than, say, air thick with pig carts and medieval optimism. Women would often tailor these fragrant assemblies for specific emotional or spiritual ailments. A posy might contain rue for warding off evil, rose petals for calming the spirits, and a hint of yarrow, because gosh darn it, sometimes you just needed your blood to clot. Today, we might smile sleepily at the thought of carrying around a bouquet as both therapy and perfume. But back then, scent was more than lovely. It was deeply practical. In a time before windows had glass and before streets had anything resembling sanitation, choosing to gently inhale sweet basil was as much about self-preservation as it was about personal flair. Furthermore, no one quite trusted air that didn't have a good dose of thyme in it. Hospitals, or rather rooms with more than one injured person and someone who at least claimed to be good with wounds, might burn rosemary to cleanse the space. And poor beds often had their straw stuffed with dried lavender or wormwood, helping drive away both fleas and existential despair. It wasn't all folktale and guesswork either. Modern science would later confirm what Margaret and her fragrant friends already suspected. Some herbs did, in fact, contain antibacterial or antifungal properties. Of course, they didn't explain it with words like microbes. They just nodded wisely and said, "It always tastes bitterest when it works best." And let's not underrate the importance of placebo performed with great flair. If you truly believed that sniffing your peppermint sprig 3 times before bed would banish nightmares, then good heavens, you were more likely to enjoy dreamless sleep than the knight next door who slept with his boots on and a conscience full of unpaid tavern bills. So whether you preferred your medicine in the form of a steaming cup of spiced dandelion root, or tied with twine in a pocket near your heart, herbs were part of the very air medieval women breathed in, sometimes literally, often enthusiastically. As we tiptoe out of the seasoning-scented stillness of Margaret's garden, herbs swaying gently in the light of a sleepy dusk, we may find ourselves wondering, what else have we forgotten about the quieter healers of history? Let's drift through that question as we wander into our next dreamy discovery. Chapter 14. A spoonful of honey, a pinch of nightshade. If you were traipsing through a medieval village in, say, the year 1347, ideally not during the plague, but perhaps on a quiet Tuesday, you might come across an innocuous hedge witch lady standing before a bubbling iron cauldron, gently spooning honey into something mysteriously viscous and very slightly hissing. Congratulations. You found yourself in the medicinal middle ground between delightful remedy and accidental curse. You see, for women practicing the healing arts in the Middle Ages, whether they were called wise women, herb wives, or slightly suspicious aunts, The line between sweet relief and poisonous error was thinner than a hairbreadth, thinner even than parchment scraped thrice for ecclesiastical reuse. And honey, honey, was the darling of the medieval medicine cabinet. It soothed, preserved and sweetened, especially when the concoction otherwise smelled like a compost pile in July. Honey made almost anything palatable, including brews made of things like nettles, wormwood, or something ambiguously referred to as dragon's breath, though no dragons were known to have been consulted for clarity. Honey's healing properties were well understood. It had antimicrobial qualities, acted as a salve for wounds, and starred in cures for sore throats, infected eyes, and even melancholy. A lovely balm, fit for queens and cows alike. In fact, it might surprise you to learn that some veterinary remedies and human remedies of the time had a mystical amount of overlap. If Elflida the cow was limping, and Lady Agnes of Swinton had a similarly troubling knee, the odds were good they'd both end up with poultices wrapped in the same bandage recipe. The only difference being that Elflida didn't pretend to enjoy the treatment, but honey had its darker dance partners. Enter nightshade, also known by its somewhat ruder botanical name, Atropa belladonna, meaning beautiful lady, not because it was famously worn by them, but because a dab in the eyes dilated the pupils, creating a dreamy, doe-eyed appearance that was, back then, inexplicably fashionable. That the plant could also, at slightly higher doses, make you vibrate with hallucinations, forget your name, and stop your heart, was a minor footnote. Yet, nightshade had a curious place in medical lore. In tiny, whispering amounts, it was used as a sedative for pain, helping with cramps, fevers, and perhaps ill-advised love spells. Administered by a careful, experienced hand, it could soothe a suffering patient, but mishandled, even by a fraction of a pinch, and, well, let's just say that medieval gravestones rarely listed overzealous apothecary as cause of death, though the implication was sometimes clear. Women herbalists kept small bags of crushed dried nightshade hidden among their collection, always labelled in careful runes or skirts embroidered with quiet warnings. Some say the plants were kept under lock and key, alongside elderberry tinctures, dried yarrow blossoms, and that one particularly foul-smelling root known as devil's tongue, which, incidentally, neither belonged to the devil nor his tongue, but was certainly mouth-offensive. What's rather curious is how communal some of these potions were. Recipes weren't hoarded out of selfishness, but shared at markets, or whispered softly during candlelit weaving circles, while the men outside argued about whose ox had trampled whose barley. A woman from the next village might arrive with a new preparation she learned from her mother's mother, something soothing for heartbreak or an ointment for chilblains. They'd trade these formulas the way we now might swap cookie recipes or mildly disturbing gossip. And while monks were busily compiling manuscripts heavy with Latin doctrinals and suspiciously long lists of saints with chronic digestive ailments, it was women who kept the tactile knowledge of what healed and what didn't. If a child had a fever that wouldn't break, a wise woman knew when to turn to elderflower tea and when to lean into prayerful murmuring under the waning moon. Let us not forget, many of these remedies were accompanied by incantations or gestures. We're talking whispered words, not explosive spells. Think less fireball, more may this wart find the road home. That sort of thing. Whether such rituals had true effect or just comforted the patient into a placebo-induced nap, well, comfort, you'll agree, has always been a fine medicine. And so, These women walked the crooked lanes between salvation and suspicion, bearing baskets of balm and bottles of tinctures, often wound in linen and sealed with wax impressed by thimbles or their own careful thumbprints. The mixture of the sweet and the sinister, the honey and the nightshade, this was part of their art. And while some entries in their recipe books are tantalizingly vague, a pinch of that thing behind the mill, the general wisdom remains: balance, care, and a good deal of not overdoing it. Speaking of balance, close your eyes now and breathe like a May evening as we prepare to stir another blend of medieval magic in our next sleepy dose of old world wonder. Chapter 15: A teaspoon of soot and a pinch of moonlight. Among the more peculiar items tucked into the drawers and jars of a medieval woman's herbal cabinet, you might find the following inventory: dried marjoram leaves, powdered deer antler, and yes, a lovingly pinched spoon of chimney soot. Don't worry, we'll get to the soot soon enough. While modern pharmacies prefer things sealed in foil with names that sound like robot lawyers, Mediflomox or Xantrexinol, medieval medicine leaned into the poetic. Remedies were less about standardized trials and more about what herbs happened to be growing near the back gate under a full moon. Lovage, motherwort, vervain, names that sound like fairies in a Shakespearean side hustle, were all lovingly gathered, dried, muddled, and boiled down into concoctions that were, at worst, entirely useless, and at best, only mildly explosive. But make no mistake, these potions were not brewed by bumbling peasants stirring random leaves into a cauldron with a laughably oversized spoon. No, medieval women, many of them healers, midwives, wise women, and household witches, the cozy kind, not the broom-chucking kind, often had encyclopedic knowledge passed down orally or jotted in the margins of recipe books between instructions for rabbit pottage. Let us lean in gently now and peer over the shoulder of such a woman. Her name, let's say, is Agnes, and she lives in a small thatched cottage with hens too confident for their own good, and a husband who's been coughing since the walnut harvest. Agnes has an apothecary's mind hidden beneath her woolen bonnet, and tonight she's making a cold remedy involving turnip syrup, elderflower tea, and something known mysteriously as dragon's bile, which, before you worry, was likely just a blend of bitter herbs soaked in vinegar. No actual dragons were inconvenienced in the making of this remedy, though we cannot say the same for the vinegar. Now back to the soot. Why on earth would Agnes reach beneath her hearth and scoop out a little pile of charcoal-smudged soot? Simple. Because soot was believed to have drying properties, and medieval belief held that illness often stemmed from excess moisture, phlegms, or humours getting too full of themselves, much in the way your modern phone might overheat endlessly unless you clear its cache. So too did medieval bodies, apparently, need drying out with substances that were dry, gritty, and vaguely alarming. A little soot might be mixed with honey, a popular method for making almost anything palatable, including onion tonics and crushed snail shells. Then it'd be dabbed onto the chest for congestion, or sometimes mixed into pastes for stubborn skin conditions, such as the goat bite rash, which may or may not have been invented by overly creative cows. Of course, Agnes wouldn't simply hand over a soot-laced paste without mumbling a short charm or prayer over it, murmuring words half in Latin and half in hope. These weren't spells in the dramatic wand-waving sense, but rather little pleas to St. Hildegard, or maybe to the nearest willow tree, whichever was more responsive that evening. It's important to add that women like Agnes did more than just stir and soothe. They kept alive centuries of plant lore, often overlapping with what we now call pharmacognosy, the study of medicines derived from plants. Indeed, many of their scrap-inked receipts, the medieval word for recipes, included ingredients that modern medicine later took quite seriously. Willow bark, for instance, which contains salicin, a predecessor to aspirin, or digitalis from the foxglove plant. Used carefully, it could strengthen a frail heart. Used incautiously, it could yeet that same heart straight into legend. Yet most remedies were composed with gentler intentions in mind. A warm compress, a daisy poultice, a cordial of rose petals and sugar boiled 3 times in wine. The sort of treatments designed not to replace the healer, but to slow the suffering, to comfort the grieving, to say, "Here, I made this for you. I stirred it with the same spoon I used to make pudding, but today, it's for healing." Before we go, let us consider one small, sleepy moment in the candlelight. Agnes, seated by her hearth, grinding licorice root into powder. The air smells faintly of lavender. Something's bubbling on the hearth, and the hens outside have finally tucked in for the night. She hums a song older than words as she folds the powdered root into linen, tying it off with a twist of red thread. Tomorrow, someone's child will sleep easier because of this bundle. And Agnes, she'll be up at dawn, collecting dew. Someone somewhere told her morning dew could soothe a sorrowed soul. And after all, it never hurt to try. Speaking of dew and dawn, in our next little wander through history, we'll find ourselves among secret gardens and flowering cures known only to those who whispered with the wind. Rest easy and dream of petals. Chapter 16. Lavender Bundles and Quiet Rebellions. In the stillness of a medieval dusk, when the hearth crackles low and the chickens murmur their final thoughts of the day, there was often a woman, sometimes a widow, sometimes a mother, sometimes just someone with time on her hands, gathering lavender. Now, this wasn't merely for the pretty fragrance that made neighbors swoon with envy or for putting behind one's ears to impress the baker's boy. No, lavender in the Middle Ages did much heavier lifting than its flowery reputation might suggest. It soothed the nerves, eased headaches, kept moths from snacking on tunics, and rather critically, warded off what everyone dreaded, but no one wished to name out loud: bad air. Which wasn't just air that smelled suspicious, it was a whole theory of disease. Let's drift gently into the realm of these lavender gatherers, the quiet, yet quietly rebellious women who folded nature into healing, one herbal sachet at a time. You see, when plague ghosts whispered through villages or husbands came home muttering medieval nonsense possibly caused by spoiled mead or severe thoughts, women reached for their lavender, tied in bundles, stuffed into pillows, brewed into relaxing tisanes. It was thought to dissolve melancholy and steadiness, which frankly was impressive for a flower. In convents, nuns cultivated lavender with all the precision of apothecaries and the calm tenacity of people who were regularly told not to be clever. Take Sister Adelheid of what is now southern Germany, known in her cloister for her sleepy wine, a concoction of red wine, honey, crushed lavender, and just a mumble of valerian root. Medieval sleep aids were not subtle, but some women, far from the cloisters, made magic with lavender that skirted the edge of acceptable. Enter Marjorie the miller's wife, owner of 3 goats, 7 hens, and 1 very frustrating husband. She dried lavender above her hearth, ground it with rosemary and mint, and mixed it with beeswax and lard to create what she dubbed the balm of not today. This soothing salve was popularly whispered to, banished difficult moods in children and grown men alike. Whether it worked on the mood or simply made the user smell too nice to be angry around is, as ever, lost to the scented winds of time. Lavender was not simply a medicine. It was a soft revolt. Women who weren't allowed to speak in councils or own property could still wield this glowing purple herb like a silken weapon of calm. And that, dear dreamer, is not nothing. In some courts, perfumed handkerchiefs, lavender-scented, embroidered, delicately waved in hallways, served as a girlish accessory with unexpected power. A waft of lavender could signal everything from "I'm harboring strong opinions under this bodice" to "I suspect your boots are full of ill-advised fungi," all without saying a word. Ladies, after all, had limited options and unlimited cleverness. One monk in 1342 even accused a group of village women of olfactory heresy. Apparently, they were burning lavender and juniper together outside their huts, a practice he deemed suspiciously comforting and thus suspect. He claimed it dulled the senses to sin. The women claimed it dulled the smell of fish. Regardless, they continued, and the monks sulked for 3 more winters. In the warmth of these tales, we find not sorcery or scandal, but the modest bravery of daily resistance. A widow steeping calming herbs for a nervous neighbor, a daughter massaging lavender oil into her mother's temples, a friend tucking a sprig into another's pocket before market. Lavender medicine was never just about lavender. It was about finding fragments of peace in a world that believed women had no business mixing plants unless they were conveniently edible. And yet they did. They planted, gathered, bundled, tinctured, and infused. They pushed back gently. Tonight, let the scent of ancient lavender drift through your imagination, wrapping you in the same quiet determination that warmed hearts and healed headaches, all from the hushed defiance of a flower. And as we snuggle deeper under our metaphorical woolen covers, the firelight beginning to dim in our memory's cottage, we'll next step into the curing smoke chambers of another curious remedy, where cheese and beeswax cross paths in remarkable harmony. Chapter 17 of Lavender, Goose Fat, and the Quiet Profession of Bone Setting. In the hush of a medieval village, before chimney smoke curled lazily into dawn, and before roosters dared disrupt the delicate peace, there were women who rose with the frost to tend not to cows or porridge, but to bones. Bones recently broken, bones misaligned, bones that creaked like old floorboards after a long winter nap. They were the bone setters, quiet, capable women with patient hands and a knowledge of human anatomy earned not in universities, but by whispering to suffering groans and listening when joints said no. You'd think bone setting was the domain of knights and battlefield chirurgeons with skewers and stitching, and perhaps shouting of Latin terms to give the illusion of prestige. But no, the best setters of bones were often peasant women, midwives and herbalists, and they didn't need a scalpel, just a firm grip, a steady gaze, and a bit of lavender oil. Ah, lavender. The medieval answer to just about anything unpleasant. It calmed nerves, soothed skin, and in this case, helped distract from the sound one's arm might make as it popped back into place with a noise reminiscent of stepping on a fresh baguette, gently. Now, before you imagine these women as wild-haired witches cracking joints like walnuts, you must understand, injuries were common back then. Rolling off carts, falling from trees, jousting gone sideways, or more frequently, tripping over your own tunic while trying to run after a goose. So women learned how to undo what gravity had done. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, mostly through demonstration, and sometimes alarmingly through the phrase, "You'll feel a little tug." Of course, tools helped. A pot of warm goose fat, excellent for massaging sore ligaments. A splint fashioned from willow bark and linen, surprisingly effective. And if someone were particularly brave or particularly unconscious, a concoction of poppy syrup and ale might be administered to make what came next slightly less memorable. Among the tools of the trade was not just physical strength, but an encyclopedic internal reference to what ought to bend and what ought not to. Education in this arena wasn't always welcomed by the church. Too many women with too much knowledge and not enough beards. How suspicious. Still, the practice flourished where official medicine feared to tread. After all, the local leech licensed physician might charge more hens than a villager owned, and his favorite treatment might involve draining blood to lighten the soul. Bone setters, on the other hand, just wanted gratitude and maybe a fresh loaf. We have records, precious, patchy records, of women in rural England, France and the Low Countries acting as the go-to healers for anything that bent the wrong way. A woman in 13th century Cornwall mended a shepherd's arm after he attempted to surf a sheep down a hill, unconfirmed but strongly suspected. Her method? Gentle traction, a binding of soaked flax, and a stern lecture about the limits of woolen transport. The women held titles unofficial but respected. They were Mrs. Martha who fixed my leg, or Old Nan who set the miller's shoulder, or simply her, the one with the hands. And their houses always smelled faintly of mint, warmth, and something reliably sticky. Sometimes, diagnosis was less anatomical and more intuitive. "That leg's telling me it's not sitting right," they might say, giving it a jostle and listening carefully, like the body was a musical instrument in need of tuning. And remarkably, it often worked. Their fingers knew things. In Scotland, it was said that some healers had the sight, not just for spirits or omens, but for muscles and ligaments misbehaving. Whether they possessed second sight or simply world-class pattern recognition, we'll let the historians debate. The bones, however, were grateful. Whatever their mix of learning and law, these women represented an intersection of care, pragmatism, and social cohesion. Knowing how to fix a dislocated knee was not just medicine. It was community preservation. It was keeping the baker baking, the smith smithing, and the children climbing trees again, hopefully more wisely. And in the softer mornings, after pain had ceased and splints had been tied, many of these women would go right back to feeding their chickens, stirring their stews, or tending the herbs that made their work possible. There is a quiet grace in that. Now, as night falls upon that imaginary village once more, where a mended boy chases fireflies and his mother thanks her, the one with the hands, we turn our gaze toward the next mystery tucked within hearth-lit kitchens, a poultice that purred. But that is a tale to dream of next. Chapter 18. The Lavender Widow and the Secrets of Scent. Let us drift now toward the soft hills of Provence, where sunlight slumbers between olive branches and the air itself seems perfumed with memory. In the medieval village of Forcalquier, a place nestled like a yawn between lavender fields and dusty footpaths, lived a widow known simply as Julienne. Not the salad kind, darling, no. Julienne was known for her bottles, not her broth. Julienne inherited a cottage that looked accidental, as though a breeze had placed the stones there out of polite boredom. It leaned ever so slightly to the left, as if it were perpetually listening. That same inclination applied to Julienne herself, who became the village's quiet steward of scent. A perfumer, healer, and certified neighborhood witch, non-threatening addition. Now, in the High Middle Ages, a woman who knew too much, especially about good smell and bad humours, often walked a thin line between village treasure and trial by ducking stool. Julienne managed to avoid one by publishing vague recipes and offering cookies to the constable's wife. But though her chalkboard simply read herbal oils and notions, Julienne's shelves held entire disorganized libraries of medieval aromatherapy. And while today we light expensive candles and call it wellness, in Julienne's time, scent was survival. You see, to understand medicine in medieval Europe is to understand fear, particularly the fear of breath. Inhaling bad air, or miasma, was believed to be a fast track to calamity. Anything smelly, swamps, sweat, cousins, harbored disease. So perfume powders, herbs, and pocket potpourris weren't eccentric accessories. They were medieval PPE. Julienne specialized in scent pouches known as pomanders, which sound like enchanted fruits, but were more like personal spice grenades. Hung from a chain or tucked in a bodice, these little balls were stuffed with cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, and more, all in the valiant attempt to outsniff the plague. A favorite among ladies of the manor, the Four Thieves vinegar, a potion allegedly invented by, four thieves who robbed the dead during the Black Death and lived to brag about it. The recipe was tweaked by village-wise women who added lavender, mint, sage, rue, and a dollop of vinegar so sour it could chase off both disease and unwanted suitors. Julienne's variation was less dramatic but wildly popular. Thyme steeped in wine, strained through muslin, and aged in crockery until it smelled like an herbal hug. When rubbed behind the ear or misted onto linens, it was said to fend off insects, illness, and annoying company. Quite effective. She recorded her scent knowledge in a rickety journal bound with laces from her wedding shoes. A sentimental touch, given that her husband had famously dropped dead during an argument about catnip. Still, Julienne had moved on. In this curious little book, she wrote about soul florals, her term for flowers that altered mood. Chamomile lulled worry, rose soothed anger, and sage turned muddled thoughts into manageable mumbles. She never claimed they were cures, only that they made living feel less chaotic. Interestingly, some monks from the nearby Abbey of Senonc would often knock politely at her door, seeking oils for their aching joints and incense for their spiritual woes. Julienne humoured them, mostly because they always brought bread. Years later, long after her name had wandered out of local memory, apothecaries in Avignon came across her notes and copied down her combinations, passing them off as monastic formulas. And thus, a widow's quiet genius slumbered unnoticed in the footnotes of clinical codices. Even today, her recipes echo in modern aromatherapy, diluted politely, branded profusely, and still lightly scented with the wisdom of a woman who knew how to make lavender speak. Let's rest now, imagining shelves lined with glass bottles catching gold in the candlelight. And a breeze, sweet with time and memory, drifting through the lavender fields. Next, we'll follow the footsteps of a hedge witch who made potions that could get you out of chores, or into serious romantic mischief, depending on how much dill she used. Chapter 19. The Lavender Widow and the Disappearing Headache. Hushed hills rose beyond the hedgerows, and beneath their dreamy shadows, villagers whispered of a widow who smelled faintly of lavender and always knew precisely when a headache was coming to town. Her name was Adela, once married to a shepherd who had an unfortunate misunderstanding with a very determined ram. Since then, Adela carried herself with an air of calm detachment, and a growing collection of dried herbs, ceramic jars, and well-informed glances. While most people spent their evenings dodging fevers or avoiding the local monk's sermons, Adela spent hers perfecting the noble art of medieval headache relief, a pursuit as vital as it was invisible. Now, medieval folks weren't entirely sure what caused headaches. Some blamed bad humors, others suspected tiny demons with anvils inside your forehead, and the rest blamed peasants having too many thoughts too fast. And so, it was left to people like Adela, quiet women with observant minds and a way with boiling cauldrons, to soothe the aching minds of the Middle Ages. Adela's workshop smelled almost offensively wonderful. There were dried bunches of feverfew and mint hanging from the rafters like upside-down bouquets preparing for a masquerade. She swore by feverfew, known since Roman times for its ability to prevent those who were smitten by migraine from becoming thoroughly useless for an entire feast day. She used it in dried doses and sometimes in honey cakes so potent that men would vow their temples stopped throbbing just from smelling the pastry. But lavender, it was Adela's favorite child. In Latin records, the herb was called lavandula, a name so soft it sounds like it's already in bed. It was used to scent the linens of sleepy monks, to ward off plague stink from bustling streets, and, most comfortingly, to soothe weary heads plagued by the weight of wool taxes and weather. Adela made a kind of lavender and vinegar syrup, steeped for 3 moons in the dark cupboard above her goat parchment collection. A spoonful followed by a nap, or what she optimistically called twilight contemplation, often relieved both headache and household complaints simultaneously. Her remedies weren't simply floral dreams, however. Adela kept a small stash of willow bark tucked beneath the hearth's lowest stone. Long before aspirin was popped from a plastic bottle, willow bark brought pain relief to crofters, carpenters, and countless trout-boned fishermen. Salicin, its active compound, could soothe inflammation and grant merciful stillness to many a tortured forehead. Of course, not every visitor believed in her potions. A skeptical knight once arrived, armor jangling and eyes squinting from a headache 3 days old. He had tried lancing tournaments, loud chanting, and threatening the sky, all to no effect. Adela gave him a sprig of crushed rue and gently informed him it worked just as well when he stopped yelling. He returned a week later, still loud but decidedly less pained, and gifted her a helmet with a feather quill strapped awkwardly to the top. "For the chronicler of calm," he declared, before trotting off and knocking over a pile of apples. Adela never called herself a healer, only a woman with the time to notice which herbs made the wind feel sweeter after sunset. She kept no great books, no formal apprentices, nothing but thin chronicles tucked between goose-feather stuffed pillows and the hushed knowledge passed from mother to daughter, herbalist to herb sender, whisperer to widow. And while her name never appeared in royal records or dusty cathedral tax ledgers, Adela's influence spread by candlelight and comfort. Her lavender oils travelled on the hems of grateful villagers, reaching temples weary from market noise or children's riddles. Her presence became part of the village itself, a silence just after the bells tolled, the soothing hush of mid-afternoon, when headaches usually whispered their arrival. She was not a miracle worker, but in a world of uncertain cures and mysterious ailments, of barbers doubling as surgeons and garlic doubling as cure-all, Adela offered something rarer: relief without spectacle, care without canonization, and a lavender-scented exhale from the bustling pains of peasantry. As stars blinked gently over her thatched roof, Adela stirred a steaming cup of valerian tea and listened to the night. Somewhere, a novice apothecary was carefully clipping mint in hopes she might follow in Widow Adela's quietly curative footsteps. And somewhere else, a strange little abbess was scribbling something rather curious about sleep potions, and things were about to get just a touch peculiar. Chapter 20 of Basil, Beeswax and the Village Love Charm. Picture, if you will, a twilight hour in a cobbled village where chimney smoke curls politely into an indigo sky, and the hens have put themselves to roost without complaint. Somewhere between the soft creak of a wooden gate and the rustle of a drying herb bundle, we find a quietly powerful figure of the medieval world, the village healer, and more specifically for tonight, her curious contribution to romantic diplomacy. Yes, we are speaking, quite dreamily, of love potions. But lest you imagine hearts in cartoonish thought bubbles or bubbling cauldrons with neon steam, no. Medieval love potions were far more subtle, and often surprisingly sticky. Let us begin with basil. This sweet little herb, now so serenely plopped atop your modern lunchtime pesto, was practically a Casanova in leaf form. Across Europe, basil was believed to stir affection and longing in the soul of anyone who sniffed it. Some texts from the 12th and 13th centuries advised women to tuck a fresh basil leaf into their bodices, not for seasoning poultry, mind you, but for seasoning one's prospects. They'd waft past the blacksmith or the miller, dishing out fragrant waves of affection. Enter beeswax, the quiet co-star in many a potion. While basil kindled desire, beeswax held it fast in spell. Women would melt beeswax over a low flame, often in a walnut shell, of all things, and blend it with honey, rose petals, or sometimes, in rarer and racier cases, whisperings of personal relics like nail clippings. Why nail clippings? Well, it was widely believed that parts of your body, a hair, a snippet of fingernail, still held onto your essence. And if someone else mixed that essence into a lovingly concocted syrup, well, there you were, emotionally implicated. Some potions were consumed, others were merely worn, dabbed on the skin, or stitched into little sachets hidden in the hem of a dress. Not everyone trusted internal use. After all, potion accidents were not unheard of, and no one wanted a misguided dose of love to spiral into gastrointestinal woe. But love potions weren't all swooning and sweetness. Some recipes, particularly those scribbled in the most hushed corners of medical text, included less charming components: mare's milk, dove heart, even powdered antler. One 14th century note recommends a love sachet made from the entrails of a newly caught hare, wrapped in linen and hung about the beloved's neck. Romance, apparently, with a hint of damp fur. These recipes weren't necessarily meant to deceive or manipulate. In many cases, they represented something more earnest and tender: hope. When courtship was more often arranged than dreamed, a young woman might pin her future to a pinch of lavender soaked in wine, praying for a love that gave more than it demanded. Still, it wasn't all wishful tinctures and hopeful herbs. The church, never one to let a bit of magic slip by unsermoned, frowned mightily upon these concoctions. Officially, love potions were discouraged as either witchcraft or dangerous superstition. But try telling that to Maud the baker, whose almond cakes were suspected of winning her not only customers, but also 2 successive husbands and 1 agreeable woodcutter. It's worth noting, too, that while many of these potions were crafted by women, they weren't exclusively for women. Men, particularly bashful or bookish ones, also sought mixtures to catch the attention of village lasses or barmaids who otherwise wouldn't give their ale a second glance. One particularly bashful monk wrote in the margin of a manuscript that powdered lily root bestows upon the tongue the eloquence needed for truth and affection, even unto a maiden who surpasseth thy courage. It reads suspiciously like medieval code for help me flirt without sweating profusely. And so, by hearthlight and hope, by rosemary wrapped in dreams, the love potion found its place in the quiet kitchen laboratories of women who knew ingredients both for the belly and the heart. Whether they worked or not is hard to say. History does not measure longing in teaspoonfuls, nor heartbreak in pinches of sage. But the potions themselves, scrappy, fragrant, stitched together from folklore and the backs of drying cupboards, offered, at the very least, a little courage, and the occasional third husband. Now, as the moon rides higher and the beeswax cools in its walnut shell, let's settle deeper into our pillows. There's more yet to explore in the hush and hushes of herbal lore. Tomorrow's draft may not be for love, but for something far earthier and altogether itchier, the cures of medieval midwives. Chapter 21. The Lavender Conspiracy. Perfumes, Pestles, and Power. There's something sly and sweet about lavender. It grows quietly, dreams in violet, and smells like serenity itself. But in medieval times, tucked within overgrown herb gardens and beside soot-streaked hearths, lavender wasn't just for pleasant kisses behind the ear or disguising the stench of chamber pots. No, lavender was a tool of the wise, with women at the helm, stirring, distilling, and sometimes, just maybe, plotting. Let us drift, quiet as candle smoke, into the faintly purple world of medieval women's perfumed remedies, where fragrance met folklore, and where power, ever so politely, wafted in through the back door. You see, perfumes weren't simply indulgent spritzes in disguise. In the Middle Ages, they were potions with PR ambitions. A woman didn't just dab rosewater on her temple because it was pretty. She did it to ward off plague, or at the very least, the plague of a tedious suitor. Perfumed waters were believed to purify the air, and in a time when illness was thought to spread by miasma, the very breath of bad smells, scented tinctures functioned almost like invisible shields. Medieval women, particularly those without husbands, academic degrees, or legal power, leaned into their botanicals. With mortar and pestle, with copper stills and secret family scrolls, or, failing those incredibly gossipy neighbors, they refined herbs into elixirs. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and marjoram. Each held properties both medicinal and suspicious. A well-placed sachet could signal good health or inspire rumors of spellwork. The art of distillation, that magical process of coaxing the soul of a plant into a bottle, was often practiced right in women's homes. And while monks and apothecaries may have been handed the credit in dusty manuscripts, records show that Widow Marjorie and Matron Agnes and that strange girl with the cat were whipping up fragrant cures themselves and selling them quite lucratively. Perfume gloves were one such aromatic invention. Picture them: smooth leather softened by oil, imbued with orange blossom, coriander, or, yes, lavender. Worn by noble women, perfume gloves elevated one's status and also conveniently kept less than desirable odors and people at bay. Of course, there were rumors, weren't there always, that a woman might sew gloves in something stronger, an herbal mixture that could alter moods, dull senses, or inspire love or digestive discomfort in an unsuspecting gentleman. No solid evidence, of course. just lots of lace gloves and nervous courtiers. And then there were the pomanders, small, often ornate metal balls filled with fragrant substances, worn or carried as a kind of olfactory force field. Women would stuff them with powdered herbs and resins, cloves, cinnamon, myrrh, camphor. It was said to ward away plague, but some clever women used them to ward away boredom, dull conversation, or overwrought prayers at Mass. If ever there were a medieval equivalent of noise-cancelling headphones, it was a pomander filled with ground rose petals and smug efficiency. Sometimes perfumes weren't worn, but rather sipped, more tea than toilette. Syrup of violets, as soft and purple as a sigh, was taken as a cooling tonic. Sprigs of thyme might be steeped into a tisane to calm the nerves, and a draught of lavender-infused wine. Well, that was for the sleepless, or the romantically disappointed. Women, particularly in nunneries and wealthier households, documented these concoctions in recipe books known as herbals. These books gleamed with pressed flowers, tight calligraphy, and the occasional splotch of wine stains and mystery. They were passed down like treasures, because in truth, they were. Each blend of scent, each record of a curative perfume or a love potion that worked suspiciously well, these were more than beauty rituals. They were autonomy, agency, and a very quiet revolution. And so, lavender isn't just a fragrance, it's evidence that women, long denied command over laws and armies, found mastery in petals and potions. They spread protection and allure through whispers of scent. They medicated and mediated with vials and velvet satchels, all in a world that often pretended they were best heard humming in the background. So the next time your pillow smells faintly of lavender, wonder, just briefly, who might have left it there. And speaking of soft surprises, our next stop takes us to the realm of charms and curses, with feathers, ribbon, and perhaps a chicken or two. Chapter 22. The Whispering Walls of the Women's Herb Garden. When you step into a medieval herb garden, time does not march forward. It stretches out like a cat in a patch of sun. Smooth, slow, and entirely uninterested in getting up anytime soon. These gardens, often kept by nuns, midwives, and cunning women, were fragrant sanctuaries tucked behind timbered walls, gardens where medicine grew in leaves and spells lived in roots. Tonight, we press barefoot into the dewy green of one such walled garden. The moon is yawning wide overhead, and the rosemary is eavesdropping. Now, if you're picturing a tidy modern garden with neat rows and plastic labels, allow me to gently shatter that illusion like a clay cup dropped during Vespers. Medieval herb gardens were messy by modern standards, delightfully chaotic, planted according to a rhythm only the gardener could hear. The lavender might be nodding near the leeks. The sage leaned over like it had a secret, and somewhere near the stone bench covered in lichen, you'd almost always find rue, the bitter herb that nobody liked, but everyone needed. Rue was the compulsive cough cure of the 13th century. It was boiled, chewed, steeped, even worn in amulets around the neck to keep away the bad air, a rather polite medieval phrase for plague, gossip, and any smell worse than your own. You see, these walled gardens served double duty: medicine cabinet and manuscript. Medieval women read these herbs like a sleepy scholar with a well-worn book. Here stood comfrey, for the mending of broken bones and the soothing of egos bruised during poorly executed jousts. There bloomed feverfew, dainty, white-petaled, and perpetually annoyed by migraines. Staring out across this medicinal jungle, One could practically hear the whisper of 1,000 whispered recipes, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, woman to woman. One such woman was Sister Amabel, a nun of no particular fame, great fondness for cats, and a suspicious talent for making toothaches disappear. She tended her garden as one might tend confession, gently, but with impressive results. Her diary, discovered much later in a crumbling abbey, included scribbled marginalia such as, "Best to use elderflower before vesper bells. Bees are sleepy then." There's something undeniably soothing about imagining her there in the early morning fog, humming a hymn beneath her breath, spreading crushed marjoram across a wound with all the precision of a medieval surgeon's apprentice, only significantly more effective and much less sweaty. Perhaps the most adored herb in such gardens, among plants and people alike, was chamomile. Not only was it the go-to for calming nerves, sore bellies, and disapproving bishops, it had a charming trick. The more it was trampled, the better it grew. A perfect metaphor for medieval women, don't you think? But for all their roots and remedies, these gardens were also quiet revolt. In an age where women's thoughts were often inked out of manuscripts and scribbled out of history, these green spaces allowed them to wield power gently. Like brewing a potion so slowly, the world didn't notice the change until it was already healed. With mortar and pestle, they composed subtle symphonies. With calendula salves, they wrote love letters to future generations' skin conditions. A typical healing potion from the herb garden might have looked like this. Take betony for melancholy, peppermint for digestion and dignity, and muddle them both with rose petals and honey. Strain through linen, whisper a prayer, serve warm, in a cup that knows secrets. But oh, beware the frankincense thief. A medieval garden was not without mischief. Teenage novices and wide-eyed apprentices were often caught swiping pinches of spice or petals for unauthorized dream sachets. One irritable abbess reportedly labeled her oregano for warts only, to discourage experimentation. It only intrigued them more. And so, the walled herb garden stood, half monastery, half mystery, a place where medicine wore a floral crown and women wrote their science in soil. Tonight, we'll leave Sister Amabel to her twilight harvest. She'll be gathering thyme, carefully, as if collecting tiny stars to rub into the balm that cures sorrow and stubborn elbows. Let's close the gate slowly behind us, with a soft creak and the scent of sweet woodruff still hanging on our sleeves. Somewhere beyond the garden, beyond the curling smoke of an herb-stuffed brazier, we'll next explore a curious chapter in the life of one secret-keeping potion, a liquid legacy hidden in plain sight. Chapter 23. The Whispering Lavender and the Elixir of Secret Sisters. Across the sleepy stone villages of medieval Europe, winding beneath crumbling archways and whispering through the moss-blanketed abbey gardens, drifted the delicate, peppery scent of lavender. Not just the signature fragrance of linens tucked in oaken chests or nuns' cloisters with surprisingly floral overtones. No, lavender was part of something far deeper, something conspiratorially cozy. This, dear listener, was the age of the elixir of secret sisters. Now, before you imagine a coven of glitter-drenched fairies whispering over steaming cauldrons, picture instead a trio of very tired women, possibly named Marjorie, Isolde, and the one everyone calls Good Wife, perched on worn stools beside a hearth. They're exchanging recipes not for stew, but for strength, and possibly menstrual relief, because lavender, sweet and calming though it is, was part of a quietly growing pharmacopoeia of herbs designed not to charm princes or ward off dragons, but to soothe cramps, calm nerves, and occasionally encourage a womb to do what nature had seemingly forgotten. And in this chapter, we gently trace the powdered lavender path to one of the most secretive brews of Lady Lore, the elixir of secret sisters. Its name wasn't found in any official medical compendium. On no monastic scroll did a scribe ever write, "Secret Sister Elixir, see Index." But pass your ears beneath the whispering rafters of a mill house or over the weaving looms in a convent, and you might have heard talk of a mixture made from lavender, rue, pennyroyal, and mint. Herbs not just for fragrance, but for function too. Now, pennyroyal was a favourite in these subterranean women's apothecaries. It tickled the senses and, when concentrated, was believed to stimulate menstruation, what the local priest might have called ungodly tampering with the natural order. Wise women simply called handling business. In dusty kitchens and garden corners, midwives and herb-wise widows blended these botanicals into tinctures, oils and teas, or, if necessary, something stronger. Used with care and never recklessly, the elixir served as a lady's most intimate secret. It carried with it not only botanical power, but the strength of communal knowledge, passed hand to hand, whispered from sister to sister, aging mother to inquisitive niece, with a little too much curiosity and not enough experience. And it wasn't just about the monthly flowers, as they might dare to euphemize it. The mixture could be used to soothe insomnia, the lavender again, to calm a fretful cough, mint a godsend, or to ease the bloat of a hearty barley stew poorly timed with one's corset lacing. Was it always effective? As with most ancient medicine, we enter the foggy realm of sometimes. Maybe it worked. Maybe the simple act of gathering, drying, mixing, and sharing made the women feel better in ways science hadn't yet figured out, but the soul understood implicitly. The clergy, as ever, watched from the periphery. They didn't quite understand what the elixir was, but it smelled of female agency and herbaceous control, and that was enough to label it suspicious, possibly sinful. And so, it became even more cherished in its secrecy. We find notes of it in the margins of old calendars. Brew lavender before Michaelmas, or ask Ellen for the stronger kind. One particularly daring recipe was scratched in the flyleaf of a cookbook, masquerading as a mutton pie journal. No one trusted official channels. After all, the only thing more enduring than oppression was the cleverness required to outwit it. And that cleverness? Oh, it passed on like a favourite shawl in winter. Not loudly, but with reverent care. Today, the elixir of secret sisters is mostly an echo, a ghost in the greenhouse, a sleepy smile rising from a lavender sachet tucked inside a cedar drawer. But if you've ever found unexpected calm in mint tea, or felt strangely wise while holding a sprig of lavender between your fingers, you too might be part of that ancestral knowing. So breathe in slowly, inhale history, one petal at a time. The women before you whispered secrets into leaves and petals, and somehow those secrets reached you. And now, with herb-scented dreams spinning slowly into view, we drift toward another quiet mystery, just beyond the garden gate. Chapter 24. The Midnight Still Room and the Secrets of Sleep. And so, dear dozer of dusk, we arrive at the final chamber, the still room at midnight, velvet shrouded in moonlight, smelling faintly of lavender, beeswax, and the sort of herbs that make a cat stare into middle distance. This is where the wise women of medieval Europe crafted their most intimate magic, the art of gentle sleep. Now, you might imagine that medieval folk fell into bed each night exhausted from tilling, spindling, or dramatically escaping plague carts. And yes, fair enough, many did. But sleep, that tricky little conundrum that still plays hard to get, was often as elusive in the 12th century as it is today. Imagine a drafty cottage, feasting fleas, and your neighbour reciting psalms through the wall. Not exactly a spa retreat. Enter the unsung heroines of herbal peace. Women who understood the language of leaves, the poetry of petals, the lull of lilac and poppy. Their remedies for sleep could be sipped, soaked in, snuffed, or tucked inside your pillowcase. An herbal embrace from centuries past. One favoured sleep draught of the time, a sort of proto-tea, was made of warmed wine or ale steeped with lettuce seeds, chamomile, and that medieval MVP, poppy. Not your average salad dressing, no. Poppies, with their silky red petals and secret strength, held a potent place in the somnolent toolkit. While modern folks might shiver at the word opiate, medieval medicine considered poppies a gift from the heavens if used with the right hand and an extra prayer. Rosemary was another nocturnal ally. We think of it now as a roast potato companion, but in medieval times it was thought to strengthen memory by day and calm the mind by moonlight. One 15th century stillroom book recommended hanging rosemary above the bed for quietness of thoughts. Quite a feat, considering the average medieval mattress was stuffed with straw and aspirations. Women often made sleep sachets, cloth pouches filled with lavender, marjoram, mugwort, a plant that sounds like a Dickens character but smells like dreamlight, and sometimes valerian root. Valerian, bless its snoozy heart, smells like something that's been hiding under a damp log, but it works like a lullaby brewed underground. It was called All Heal, and heal it did, especially minds too full of worries about livestock, cholera, or whether a neighbour was casting mild shade spells again. And let us not forget the subtle ritual of bedtime baths. While it's true that full bathing was a luxury, and depending on the century, deemed anywhere from optional to Satan's idea, there were warm herbal foot baths aplenty. Medieval recipe books list cleanses of meadowsweet, thyme, and hyssop to release humours and soften dread. Foot first into serenity, as it were. Now, we must give a nod to the moon milk elixir, a mythical and mildly suspect tincture mentioned in the corner scribbles of a 14th century manuscript from an abbey in Wales. It involved goat's milk left overnight beneath a waxing moon, stirred with silver, and whispered to by someone who'd never told a lie. Unsurprisingly, the recipe was rarely completed successfully, but the very mention of moon milk soothed the anxious like a lullaby hummed from beyond a hedgerow. But perhaps the most powerful sleep potion of all wasn't brewed in a pot or written in ink. It was the woman herself, the midwife, the herb wife, the wise wife with lines on her hands like the roots of a tree. Her presence, her quiet voice, her assurance that yes, you will see morning. That was the true medicine. These women, long dismissed in the louder tales, carried the weight of worlds in their apron pockets, and in teaching others to rest, to dream, they stitched safety into the night. So, with a sachet beneath your pillow and rosemary at your head, you may now drift backward into dreams. Imagine the hush of a midnight stillroom, herbs hanging like paper lanterns, and moonlight slipping gently across warm stone. Tonight, carried by forgotten potions and whispered lullabies, you are held in the oldest cradle of all. Peace passed down through hands long gone. Sleep well, clever listener, and dream softly through the secret silence of history.